and welcome to Raw Politics Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Jo Moyer, and I'm up in a very balmy Auckland with Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Hello, Joe.
And in Wellington, in the windowless cave that is the gallery, we have our good colleague, Mark Dauder. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Joe. It's no windows in the recording studio, so I should have checked the weather in the office, but there's no windows there either, so I'm going to guess it's windy.
Fair enough. Today we're going to discuss polls, debates, the campaign, and everything in between. And to wrap up, of course, we will offer some recommendations. First up, we're almost at the halfway point of the campaign, thank goodness. So, how are things going? What are the polls saying, and how did that first leaders' debate go? Starting point, Mark, let's bring you in here, our poll numbers guy. Can you just give us a bit of a rundown of what the latest TVNZ Varian poll has for the parties at the moment?
Yeah, so that poll came out on Wednesday evening. It's the second in a round of weekly polls that One News is now going to do. So it had National on 37, that's down 2 from last week. Labour on 27, down 1 from last week. ACT and the Greens, both on 12, that's up 2 for each of them from last week. New Zealand First and the Māori Party were flat at 5 and 3 respectively. So in a seats sense, that gives National and ACT 61 between them, New Zealand's First on 6 and the Left on 53.
You've also been doing some averages with the polling numbers. Correct me if I'm wrong, New Zealand First, they are holding on 5%, so over the threshold to be in at the moment. That hasn't changed with this poll, has it?
No, that's correct. For a better part of a week now, our sort of rolling polling average has kept New Zealand First in Parliament. At one stage, I believe it showed them actually with the balance of power, National and ACT together just at 60. So that would make for a fun, if lengthy, post-election period. We'll see how it ends up turning out over the next few weeks.
Tim, what did you make of this poll? Does it say anything in particular, or...?
Well, the interesting thing to me was that National went down, and it's only by 2, I know, but National should be stretching out at this point. All the anecdotal stuff, all of us out in the campaign are seeing and hearing from virtually everybody we meet, is it's time for a change. But it's still not breaking out. And with ACT, it's the combo at 61 or 62 seats is not really breaking out either. That's a surprise. You almost get the feeling it's got to happen at some point. But MMP does confound us and does tie things up, so perhaps not. But 3 weeks in, what have we seen, Mark? The change really has been National's gone up a bit and ACT's gone down a bit. Labour really hasn't moved the dial, maybe down a little bit. And the Greens have solidified. So we're halfway through, still not a big breakthrough.
Well, I think too, Mark, and we talked about this last week, the sort of knocking on the door / in the door of the 40 for National, and that sort of seemed to be like, well, okay, they've got out of that rut of being stuck in the sort of low to mid 30s, and we're on 39 and 40 with the 2 polls last week. Now back at 37, and you sort of go, well, okay, that's, margin of error, take all of that into consideration, but still from National's perspective, being at 39 or 40 is a big shift for them in mood, momentum, all that sort of stuff, isn't it? And if you see them start coming back to that sort of mid-30 mark, that starts to put the wobbles on again a little bit too, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And, 61 or 62 is, you can make it work. You've got to be pretty disciplined. And you haven't got much room for some of the things they'd like to do that if somebody in ACT or somebody in Labour, in National goes wobbly on you, so somebody loses their nerve or has a particular cause they're not willing to go with, it just gets things really murky.
Yeah, if one thing to think about with these numbers is, yes, in most of the polls where New Zealand First makes it in, that has National and ACT in the low 60s. But if New Zealand First gets 4.9% of the vote, they drop out. The proportions shift, and National and ACT end up with a more comfortable 64-65. So, either way, given that Winston has ruled out working with Labour, if we assume that holds even in a post-election scenario where he holds the balance of power, the cliff to climb for Labour and for the left is still really, really high, even if National and ACT on their own are still in this low 60s, even high 50s area. It requires a big change for the overall colour of the government next term to look different from what it looks like it's going to be now.
I was going to say, so David Seymour really, really, really wants New Zealand First not to get that, doesn't he? For a whole lot of, for his own sort of boost as well as for them not to be denying them.
Yeah, I've actually just come away from a press conference with David Seymour and put the question to him about, you obviously don't like New Zealand First. You talk about that. And Christopher Luxon is certainly not ruling out New Zealand First and is very much accepting of the fact that if that's what the electorate delivers, then, you're going to have to work with them, because Christopher Luxon's not going to choose to not be in government just because they need New Zealand First. And, David Seymour's very much softening his position on that. And whilst they would want to have an arrangement that meant that ACT and New Zealand First are quite far away from each other in that governing arrangement and don't have any sort of particular deal, which of course is not any different to what you saw with New Zealand First and the Greens when they were in a governing arrangement with Labour. There was no deal between the Greens and New Zealand First. They were both had their own arrangement direct with Labour. And that's exactly what I think you would see if you have a potential national ACT New Zealand First arrangement as well. So taking all of those numbers then from the poll and where things are kind of sitting with that, Tim, are you feeling inspired and energised by the campaign so far?
Neither of those words would be ones I'd use. Look, I'm interested still, obviously, and more interested than many of the public who I think are turning off a bit. But it seems like a very strange and disconnected kind of campaign compared to other years. Some of the parties aren't really engaging in seeking out the public in public events or public forums. And in that regard, the Greens, are doing set pieces here and there, but not really doing a politicking, campaigning stump kind of on the hustings kind of pursuit by the two leaders. I think Te Pāti Māori are doing their own thing, seem to be pretty keen just to keep it that way. They're not really engaging much in a media way with the mainstream media anyway. National, going back and forward to events for Luxon, there's not sort of a continuity. It's not a regional thing. For example, on ACT, where is that bus? Is anyone bussing around in that bus around anywhere other than from somewhere in Auckland to somewhere else in Auckland? That used to be these tours and small town things. Peters is going to the small areas, I know, smaller towns, and speaking for New Zealand First, but not in a way that he did in the past. I don't know if they even got a bus this time. There's less of a kind of continuum, and that's been odd. It's been much more stop-start, set piece, and in and out of towns and venues in sort of 15-minute turnaround sometimes.
And the amount of time they're actually campaigning on a day-to-day basis is really, really small now. I mean, you're seeing days where either, Chris Hipkins or Chris Luxon start at sort of 9:30, 10 in the morning and are done and dusted by 1 o'clock. And it just strikes me, and Mark, we've had a big conversation about this before, the fact that, an election campaign's gone by, the sort of feeling has been the more hands that you shake of New Zealanders, the more likely you are to win the election. So John Key used that, Jacinda Ardern used that, Bill English used that, and it was all about getting out there, shaking hands, so that when people went into the polling booth, they might have had a fleeting moment, an exchange, a handshake, a how are you, how's your day been, with a leader, and that might count for something for people who aren't particularly engaged in politics. And you are just not seeing that at the moment. I mean, some of the days that have been constructed, and they're so orchestrated at the moment, I reckon you'd be lucky if some of the leaders are shaking the hands of a dozen people in one day. And the hands they are shaking are people who are probably already voting for them anyway because of where they're choosing to go. And so, Mark, I mean, what does that say, I guess, about the campaign and perhaps the divisiveness and the concern that there is for having sort of interrupters and protesters and having to be more careful, I guess, about where you campaign and how that's impacted their ability to go to places like big shopping malls, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think the campaigning from the leader's perspective and from the senior MP's perspective is really one that they're doing via social media and via the mainstream media rather than in person. If you think you need roughly 30,000 votes to get 1% of the vote, well, is either of them really going to go shake 30,000 hands over the entire election period? You'd spend all your time doing nothing but that. And when it is far much more effective and cheaper and quicker to just boost an ad to 1 million people on Facebook for $40, what you're really trying to do is get some good images, some good video of you out and about in the community, meeting with a dairy owner who was ram-raided, or meeting with a nurse who wants a better pay, or meeting with a teacher who is trying to, improve her students' grades, et cetera, et cetera. You get some good pictures, you get a little bit of B-roll, you have someone somewhere whip it up into, a glitzy ad, and then you push it to 1 million people on Facebook or maybe less Twitter. But, it's the social media. From our perspective as the mainstream media, we attend these campaign stops, but we're covering them because the leaders are there. They're only there because they want us to cover them. And so it does feel, there's a little bit of artifice here. It's kind of like we're all pretending we don't know exactly why we're there, or that there's a real sort of on-the-ground campaign effort going on, which isn't to say that there isn't from the volunteers' perspective. There are clearly big grassroots networks, but that's not what Chris Hipkins and Christopher Luxon are doing.
Well, and it's certainly racked up Winston Peters, having just had a conversation with him and him speaking at a debate also. He made the comment to me that, you're seeing Christopher Luxon holding a goat, and that's the extent of his campaign efforts. I think in the debate he used the language of one Chris is eating a sausage roll on the news at 6 p.m. and the other's eating a pie. I think Winston Peters' campaign is probably a little bit different because it doesn't have as many resources because he's obviously been out of Parliament. But he is still doing those big public, town hall type meetings, which, yes, Christopher Luxon did them over the course of the winter and got out and about and did that, but isn't doing it so much at the moment. Chris Hipkins is not doing that at all. They sort of, I guess, tend to do more of the campaign rally type thing. And saying that, you're getting big numbers. Winston Peters is drawing in sort of 400 or 500 people at some of these meetings he's holding, but I don't necessarily think that's 400 or 500 people who are going to be voting for New Zealand First. He has the personality and is such a presence that people go along because he's the guy that you want to hear listen and rant and rave about something and have a laugh. So, I wouldn't necessarily take the success of the numbers attending those sorts of meetings and say, well, Halley's definitely going to be over the 5% threshold as a result.
How's he getting about? He hasn't got a bus. Is he on horseback between cities, or how's he going? Has he got a posse following him? And
he's in between rodeos, I believe. Or some might say rodeos.
Rodeo, thank you.
Let's just have a quick chat about the debate. We've had the First Leaders debate. When was that? I've lost track of time.
Tuesday evening. Look, I went back and had a look at it because they go fast and there are things you note immediately you think aren't right.
Did 90 minutes really go fast? It didn't go fast for me in the audience. I'm just telling.
No, well, it sort of does, if you're tweeting live. Look, I was surprised on the rewatch at how many times Hipkins didn't get in on things that Luxon had said that were almost like, if you're practicing for these things with the Labour Research Unit or your team of trusted advisors, people mimicking Luxon, whoever it would be, they're almost the things that would have been set up and you would have hit away easily. There's several. On the health thing, he went back once on smoking, on Māori health. But on other things like we'll increase the total amount we spend on health and education. He could have easily asked them, but will it be more than the rate of inflation? Are you really increasing it? Or are you just going to have more money each year, which doesn't get there if the inflation is taking it to another point? Things like that. There were, I'd say, 4 or 5 occasions where, if you were his prompter, you would have just been saying, get in there. Now's your point. If you'd had an earpiece. But he didn't. He didn't take those chances, and I think that was sort of a bit of a tale of the night. He didn't take chances. Luxon just held his ground.
Now let's chat about Chris Hipkins' strange failure to fire and the strange indifference to Christopher Luxon's tax plan holes. Tim, let's start with Chris Hipkins. What is your read, I guess, on sort of how he's been going compared to, I guess, what you would have expected coming into the campaign trail?
Well, what his colleagues in Labour would have expected, both in January when he took over from Ardern and then subsequently at every sort of point, that Chris in their view, was a very active, tribal, I guess a guy who'd take the fight to national. They were trailing behind a few months ago. This was the guy who was going to take it on. I think they would be thinking, why has he failed to fire? Why is he sort of held back? Initially, months ago, they were almost nobbling him with their own behaviour and the errors of ministers and MPs. But since then, in a clean enough campaign space, I've been amazed that he's at 27% now, that he didn't take that debate on in the way that everyone assumed. He's the debater, the other guy's the newbie, he'd dominate that. But also we've talked about his failure on that personal political retail politics of being able to engage with people out on those maybe contrived political TV events. After one of his events the other day, I followed Hipkins and his police escort and his staffer several blocks through downtown Auckland. And one of the things I noticed, and it surprised me, was at one pedestrian traffic lights, we were waiting there, and the group who were waiting included two young women in their graduate gowns about to graduate from the university, capping ceremony. Everyone was standing there. The Prime Minister Hipkins right there, student leader, education minister recently, had every chance to do what probably all of us would have even done, which is to have said, congratulations, or what a great day for you guys, or enjoy your day. He just stared straight ahead, didn't engage. And I was thinking, gosh, that's sort of a very basic thing. Now, that's one anecdote, one moment, and he was preparing that day for the debate later. So his head could have been full of Christopher Luxon firing darts at him, for all I knew. But I just thought there was a sort of an indication of a lack of spontaneity and human interaction.
Yeah, and I think to roll off that into the debate, again, a strange interaction. I was in the audience at the debate, sat in the front row next to two other journalists, so Chris Hipkins knew who we were. In the first ad break, Chris Hipkins decided to come over to the audience. Chris Luxon stayed and kind of read his notes and, was staying sort of in the moment. And so initially, Brownie points to Chris Hipkins for actually kind of coming, out of that zone and deciding that he was going to engage with the audience. But he had two options. He had the option to talk to the randoms who he didn't know, who potentially he could have persuaded to vote for him, or he had the option to talk to the safe media. And he chose the media. And he came up and had a yarn to me and a couple of other journos either side of me and, a couple behind me. And I thought, why the hell are you wasting your time talking to us?
He might have thought you guys had given him a very blunt appraisal of how he'd been going.
I mean, to be fair, he was asked by someone how he thought the first section had gone, and his response was sort of like, oh, yeah, okay. And it was like, well, that's not very encouraging.
He was probably right if that was his halfway point appraisal.
But I just thought right here next to me is like a whole group of, and they were quite young people as well, sort of, people in their 20s and 30s. And why would you not go talk to them? It just comes back to this whole point of like, he's really good with people he knows and is comfortable with, but he's utterly terrible with random members of the public. And I mean, Mark, you've been out with them too and kind of experienced this as well. What's your take on this sort of inability to kind of have small talk with, potential voters?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is something he's just not good at and probably not comfortable with. I remember very clearly watching the TV news after the Auckland floods and then after the cyclone. And, him wandering around some of those devastated areas, talking to the residents who'd, lost their homes. And it was so stilted and awkward. And he just sort of, point at a wall and say, oh, the water came up to here. And you're like, this is someone's, house. It's their biggest asset. Like, it's not sort of a mild weather observation, which is the sort of way he'd framed it. But now it just seems like he's not even really bothering all that much. There was an anecdote that I've heard around going to the market, even in Upper Hutt, where he, is from, where he actually does know a lot of people, and having an exchange with someone where, he'd asked a question, they'd answered, and they just sort of stared at each other. And apparently someone timed it 8 seconds, which is a long time. If we paused for right now and stared in each other's eyes for 8 seconds, trying to think of something to say, it's a long time. And I think at this point, with these interactions with people, with his talking points, with his attitude, it just feels like his heart isn't in it, right? If he really wanted to win, if he really thought he could, if he was really gunning for it, he'd put himself in these uncomfortable positions and he'd make the best of it. But why bother to expose yourself if you've kind of given up, which is a little bit the vibe that I'm kind of getting from him on the campaign trail.
Yeah, and look, beyond Hipkins' personal kind of trials, if you like, on meeting people and on the street and so on, I actually think in other ways he's failed to fire up Labour, and the signature policies have kind of been launched and just fallen flat. GST off vegetables, hasn't worked for them. Dental should have gone better and might have, but you might argue it has. Look, the possibility of getting properly into the National Party tax cuts and cuts to government spending, that whole package. Look, we've all seen the holes, I guess, that have been poked in it, but has Hipkins really been pushing those holes well enough? Have Labour? So I really think there are opportunities going begging on that side. And before perhaps listeners think that I'm being too harsh on Hipkins, we certainly on this podcast have had a go at Chris Luxon's lacklustre performances and we have, and ACT sort of falling away, we did last week and so on. So this is not just trying to set out to belittle him, but I think we've got to be realistic. If you were the Labour team, you'd put this guy forward, you had your hopes on him because of certain qualities of, active, anti, very strong at the politics against the other side, you'd be just scratching your head a bit and thinking, gosh, could someone else maybe have done it better? I don't think so. But, you just have those start of those worries, I think.
Well, I mean, he's already losing his own caucus members. You've had Ohariu MP Greg O'Connor come out saying, I'm not on the list. I took myself off the list because I want to get in and win this electorate again. And he's now going around at public meetings saying, well, it looks as though Nicola Willis is going to be the next finance minister because they're going to be in government and we're buggered, basically. So vote for me in the electorate so that I get back in. I mean, that is terrible when you have got your own caucus going out now and saying, oh, well, it's game over.
Well, you can't have individuals chucking in the towel and then having staff go and grab the towel back and bring it back and pretend it's not there.
Yeah. So let's even this out a little bit. Christopher Luxon, he has had a few problems with trying to not talk about the potential holes or actual holes, whatever way you want to look at it and whatever economists you want to talk to about it, with this tax plan of theirs. Tim, you wrote an interesting piece this week about that and the sort of scrutiny that's come on Chris Luxon. Talk us through that.
Well, there's clearly tension between Luxon and his team and advisors and the travelling media, particularly television media, particularly Newshub, actually, but some others. And it's because they've been obsessively almost, it's a word he uses actually, obsessing about things. He keeps saying it, Luxon, but almost obsessively the questioning over that tax plan, over the foreign buyers tax, over the gambling, over other elements of it. And he's come to the view that you just don't have to do what the media ask you to do. You can just walk away. And sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it is, obsessive and it goes too long. But I think he needs to have a better answer for the public. Although we should all recognise that we're probably 2 weeks into this tax policy and the polls have held up relatively well for them. So they might say, look, we just keep ignoring it and the media might go away and the public might just shrug it off.
I do think that James Shaw kind of nailed this on the head at the Queenstown Finance debate last week. He was asked by the moderator, Jack Tame, about the tax plan, about National's tax plan and what he made of the fact that, seemingly there were all these holes in the foreign investment side of it and clawing that money back to pay for it. And James Shaw said, well, I just don't think that the public actually cares about the details and the costings of it. I think the public hears tax cut and they just want a tax cut. So when you've got James Shaw saying this and being that frank about it, there's probably some truth in that, right, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the reception it's getting from the public. I don't think that means the media should drop it. As long as National's campaigning on giving people tax cuts, it's reasonable to continue asking them, actually, how are you going to pay for it? Because everyone we've talked to says the way you've said you will isn't going to work. I think it's also maybe going to be a nasty surprise if National is in a position to govern after the election, that this sort of stuff isn't as easy to do when you're in government in terms of walking away. They're actually going to have the job of implementing it, doing the delivery or the outcomes, as Christopher Luxon would say. And if those outcomes end up not arriving because some of their campaign policy work was a bit shoddy, they're going to have to answer the questions later rather than sooner. But, if you've only got 3 weeks till the election, you may as well postpone those questions until afterwards.
It's an interesting thing, Mark, that actually it is for the opposition some of the easiest time they get right now because they can just keep pushing holes in, stoking bushfires on everything big, tax cuts, how you're going to pay for it, the grand economics. but also things as small as gang members beating people up in the street on the Coromandel. They can make advantage out of that now, right? So Mark Mitchell can go to Coromandel Town, hold a public meeting about, violence and law and order and threats. In 3 weeks or 4 weeks' time, he might be the Minister of Police. There's still going to be things like gang brawls and intimidation. There's still going to be random killings. These things then become his problem or their problem, not so easy just to rack it up.
Well, no, but presumably that would be the fault of the 6 long years of the Labour government.
Of course. That will be the thing. We've had the 9 years one has almost exhausted itself for Labour of National, and now we'll get the 6 long years of neglect and failure. But, it is the truth that things are more easy for them right now than they will be if they get in under a month.
And our audience question this week is, Mark, what is our audience question, please?
Our question is the economy finally turning around, and what's it mean for the campaign? On Thursday morning, we got the GDP figures out. They showed the economy grew in the June quarter and actually was flat in the quarter before that. So there was no recession for this whole time that Christopher Luxon was talking about New Zealand being the only country in the Asia Pacific in recession. So, what's the politics of that? It's a bit difficult to say. For Labour, it's clearly a bit of a win, Good economic news is good for the incumbents, but they're conscious that people are feeling it tough right now still, and so they can't go out there celebrating or, in Nicola Willis's terms, sort of gaslighting the public into saying everything's fine. But really, this is one of the rare opportunities they're going to get this campaign to try and turn something around, and the message on the economy is a really critical one. So, Grant Robertson on Thursday morning was pretty quiet about how happy he was about this news and what it meant, but I think they need to go a bit harder on it if they really do want to, turn the election around, because it shows there's light at the end of the tunnel. It shows things are going all right, that the economists' predictions can't be managed. And, people's perceptions of the economy are based on 2 things. One, their personal experiences, and mostly what they're seeing is rising costs. That's inflation, not recession. And 2, what they hear from politicians and from the media, which has been really grim this year. But if Labour can try and turn that narrative around, potentially people can sort of come around to feeling like maybe things aren't so bad after all.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you've enjoyed. Mark, let's start with you.
I'm bringing our international piece this week from the Washington Post, a really good story about a public school teacher in South Carolina who was reprimanded by her school district for teaching a really good book about what it's like to be black in America. Just sort of gets into that cancel culture debate, which we hear a lot about in the US, at least on the sort of officials level and governors and presidents talking about it, but what it actually means for people trying to teach their kids about, hard stuff.
And what about you, Tim?
Mine is one from Newsroom, from Aaron Smale on our election series on the big electorates that matter. It's on Ikaroa Rāwhiti and looks at the battle between Meka Whaitiri, who has stood aside from Labour, trying to fight that one for the Māori Party, and Kusha Tanari Manuel, the new person sort of dropped in there by Labour, and how they both go back to the days of Parakura Horomia, who was sort of a mentor to both of them.
Very good. And my recommendation is a brutally funny piece from Steve Braunius, who was sat behind me at the TVNZ debate in the audience this week. And he has written a piece for New Zealand Herald Premium, and it is titled TVNZ's Leader Debate, Searching for an Ounce of Charisma. It is quite a good read. Highly recommend.
Did he get a handshake from Hipkins at halftime?
He did not. But if you read the piece, you will realise that after about 30 seconds, he no longer wanted to be in the room. And that's it from Real Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, and our readers, listeners, and viewers. Please send any burning questions you have to me, joe.moyer@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.